Okay.
Hello and welcome to tonight's event, From Enslaved to Statesman. Tonight we are joined by Park Ranger Kenya Finley Jean, and she'll present on the topic, From Enslaved to Statesman. I'm going to let her take it away here in just a couple minutes, but before we get started, I just want to remind you that there is a chat box and a Q&A box. At any time during tonight's program, you're welcome to put in your questions for Kenya, and at the end of her presentation, I will read her your questions. So she'll talk for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. But anytime you think of a question, put it in that chat box, put it in that Q&A box, and I'll make sure she sees it. All right, without any further ado, I would like to welcome Park Ranger Kenya Finley Jean.
So good evening, everyone. Once again, I'd like to thank you for coming today. And as you see on your screen, it says the Civil War Defenses of Washington. That is the program that I work for here with the National Park Service in the Washington, D.C. Metro area. And just to give you a little few information about the Civil War Defenses of Washington, we are a program that works with the three major parks in the area. So that will be Rock Creek Park, National Capital Park East, and the George Washington Memorial Parkway. And if you are familiar with these parks, you know that they do have Civil War sites in them, which is earthwork forts that me and my colleagues talk about and give presentations, talks, and walks throughout the area, talking about these areas. So for today, what we are going to be talking about is from enslavement to statesman. And just to give you a brief information about this, from 1870 to 1901, 22 African Americans serve in Congress. And for a lot of folks, and I'm one of them, this was the first time I ever heard about this. I did not learn about these things in school or even in college. So when I came across this information, I was actually taken back by this. And what we're going to talk about is some of these men. And with that, 13 of these men have been born by enslaved parents. All had some form of education, and half actually went to college. And what we're going to do is actually talk about these folks. And as you see on the screen, we have some here. H.R. Roden, Rebels of Mississippi, who in 1870 became the first Black U.S. Senator and was born of free parents in North Carolina. Others you have, the 6 representatives pictured here that you see of the first color senators and representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. So those are the gentlemen that you see there. With that, you have Benjamin S. Turner of Alabama, Jefferson M. Long of Georgia, Robert C. DeLarge of South Carolina. You have Joseph H. Remy of South Carolina, who was a former slave. You have Josh T. Wells of Florida, and R. Brown Elliott has been born to free parents. And these were the group of congressmen that served during the period of 1869 to 1872. And of course, here's another photo of them actually talking about their representation in the Congress. Now, the first person we're going to talk about is John Wills Manham. Now, what he was born on April 3rd, 1868, and actually passed away on October 9th, 1863. And let me turn to that. There we go. He actually won a special election to succeed the late James Mann, whose district encompassed New Orleans, a victory that would have made him the first African American to serve. But what actually happened, his opponent, which was Cabe Hunt, contested the election and challenged his seat, his right to go into that seat there. Now, during his appeal to the House floor, Mann recounted the decision support. 64% he had received from New Orleans. And in his quote, he said, "I would feel myself recent to do the duty imposed upon me if I did not defend their rights in this floor. I do not expect, nor do I ask, that there shall be any favor shown me on account of my race or former condition of my race." So that was actually his quote while he was defending his seat to the floor. Now, what actually happened with this is that the House deemed neither candidate qualified. So neither one of them actually got it. They deemed was qualified, leaving the seat to be vacant for the remaining of the final days of the 40th Congress. In the following Congress, Joseph Rainey of South Carolina would win the election to become the first African American seated in the House. So that's actually what happened with that gentleman, was that he was there, but they contested him, and yet they left that seat vacant until Joseph Rainey came in of South Carolina to be what they would call the official first. And that's what you actually see in this picture here of him actually coming to Congress, and yet was successfully was unable to defend his election to the House. But he was there. So with that, we're going to talk about Herman Verrills. Here we go. So September 29th, 1827 to January 16th, 1901. As you can see, he was on January 20, 1870. The Mississippi State Legislature appointed him to the seat of the United States Senate that had remained vacant ever since Mississippi seceded from the Union nearly a decade ago, when the Civil War started. Now, what was he before he became a senator? He was a born preacher of Mississippi and North Carolina, born preacher, and the first African American to serve in Congress at promise of African American emancipation and enfranchisement. He later toured the United States. He was introduced as the 15th Amendment in flesh and blood. 5 weeks after his appointment as senator, Henry Wilson of Massachusetts escorted him to the front of the Senate chamber to take his oath on February 25th, 1870. In the newspaper at the time, they reported, "A curious crowd of color and white rushed into the Senate chamber and gazed at the colored senator, some of them congratulating him. A very respectable looking, well-dressed company of colored men and women then came up and took rebels captive and bore him off in glee and triumph." So that's actually talking about how they were ecstatic to actually see someone of their own actually getting this high status of in the Senate. But unfortunately, his triumph was short-lived. When his appointment expired the following year, a leading white Republican, former Confederate General James Alcorn, actually and actually ran. Alcorn took his place for a full 6-year term, but by then, Joseph Rainey, an African American Republican from South Carolina, had won election to the House, beginning what would become with him, would become 8.5 years, so 8.5 years of career in Congress. And we're actually going to talk about Joseph right here. So here's Joseph Henry Rainey, or Rainey, June 21st, 1832, passed away on August 2nd, 1887. Now, he was actually from Georgetown, South Carolina, a former enslaved. He was the first Black person to serve in the United States House of Representatives and the second Black person to serve in the United States Congress, and the first Black presiding office of the House of Representatives. Others were elected earlier, but were not seated. So that's what we were talking about before. They was elected, they got there, but they were not seated. His parents had been slaves, but his father purchased his family freedom and taught him to be a barber. The family moved to Charleston in 1846. And what actually was happening, Rainey traveled frequently outside the South and married in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1859. He was drafted, if you want to say that, but that's how they were placing it, to work as a Confederate blockade runner during the Civil War. In 1862, he escaped to Bermuda with his family, wife and family, and worked there as a barber before returning to South Carolina after the war in 1866. Once back in the United States, he joined the executive community of the newly formed South Carolina Republican Party. In 1868, he was elected as a delegate to the State Constitutional Convention. 2 years later, in 1870, he was elected to a 4-year term in the state Senate, where he soon became the chairman of Finance Committee. His tenure in the South Carolina State Senate was brief. With South Carolina Congressman Benjamin F. Whittemore resigning, Rainey won his seat in a special election. He served in the 41st Congress and was appointed to the Committee of Freemen's Affairs and the Committee of Indian Affairs. Rainey ran for re-election in 1872 without opposition. In May of 1874, he became the first African-American representative to preside over the House session. And therefore, in 1876, when the Democrats reemerged as the dominant force in South Carolina at the end of Reconstruction, Rainey barely defeated Democrat Joseph S. Richmond for Congress. Richardson was never succeed the election, contest Rainey's seat for the next 2 years. So even though he lost for 2 years, he conceded the election altogether. In 1878, Richardson won the seat, ending Rainey's congressional career. So that's actually what happened with him. And with that, you would say that what he did afterwards. He did hold a post in 1881 in Washington, D.C., and unable to attain any other appointment, he instead started a brokerage and banking firm. Unfortunately, that failed. He managed a coal and wood yard before returning to South Carolina. And unfortunately, what actually happened to him is that he died in Georgetown on August 2nd, 1887, leaving a wife and 5 children, and somewhat impoverished as that. So what we have here is Jefferson Franklin Long, March 3rd, 1836 to February 4th, 1901. Now, with Mr. Long was a politician from Georgia. He was the second African-American sworn into the U.S. House of Representatives and the only African-American to represent Georgia until Andrew Young was elected in 1972. Jefferson Long was born to enslaved mother on March 3rd, 1863 in Knoxville, which is a small town, west central Georgia. His father was believed to have been the son of a local white man. He was self-educated and became a merchant tailor in Macomb, Georgia. Trained as a tailor, he opened up a successful business in Macomb, Georgia after the emancipation following the end of the Civil War. Shortly after the war, he married Lucinda Carhart, and they raised several children. Unlike neighboring South Carolina, Georgia did not have a majority Black population or a large antebellum free Black community. As a result, Georgia freemen often looked to white politicians as leader after the war. Long was an exception with this, and in 1869, he served as a Republican state committee and was the leader of the Georgia Labor Convention, which organized Black agriculture workers to demand increased wages, better jobs, and improving working conditions. Now, Congress delayed Georgia's re-entry into the Union because the state legislature refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. And white Republicans and conservatives expelled 29 legal elected Black members from the Georgia legislature in September of 1868. So conditions for readmission included reseating the Black members and ratifying the 15th Amendment. Therefore, in July 1870, these terms were finally agreed to, and the Georgia delegates were permitted to return to Congress. A special election to follow the delegate seat from the remaining of the 41st Congress, which was in 1868 to 1871, was seat from the same day, December 20th, 1870, as the election for the full term to the 42nd Congress was done. The Georgia Republican Party chose Black candidates to run for the abbreviated term, reserving the full term for white candidates. So, in the state central district, the party nominated Long for the 42nd Congress and the state senator Thomas Jefferson Spear for the 42nd Congress. So you can see how they're working that, as I was talking about before. We'll give him the short term, and then we'll give Spear the longer term. He was elected as a Republican to the 41st Congress to fill the vacancy caused by the House declaring Samuel F. Grove. However, he was not sworn in until January 16, 1871, because of complication related to Georgia's readmission into the Union. Long took his seat 1 month after Representative Joseph Rainey of South Carolina was seated in the House. Long's term was so short, he was not assigned to any committees, yet he was determined to fight for civil rights of free slaves. So even though he did get it, his term was that short. He didn't even get on any committees, but yet he was still fighting for people who just became free. So what you have here is on February the 1st, 1871, he became the first African-American representative to speak before the House when he disagreed with a bill that exempt former Confederate politicians from swearing allegiance to the Constitution. Long argued against allowing unreputable Confederates to return to Congress, noting that many belonged to the secret society like the Ku Klux Klan, which intimidated Black citizens, and foreign loyalty to rebuild political strength. Long warned, if the House removed the disability of disloyal men, I venture to prophesies you will again have trouble from the very same men who gave you trouble before. So that was what he was telling them by not having them swear allegiance to the Constitution. Long efforts, unfortunately, was fruitless. The House voted 118 to 90 to grant Confederates amnesty. Long was the last Black representative elected from Georgia until Representative Andrew Young won his seat in 1972. Now, after Long left Congress on March 3rd, 1871, he returned back to his his tailoring business. And although he remained active in politics, he never again ran for public office, recognizing that the white controlled Georgia government had shut blacks out of politics. Long eventually became frustrated by white Republican leaders' failure to protect black Southerners. And by the late 1870s, he began encouraging African Americans to vote for independent Democrats if Republican candidates provide unsatisfactory. However, with these views also caused him his clientele in his tailor business. And unable to survive on the income from his tailor shop, he started other businesses, including a liquor store and a dry cleaning shop. He remained self-employed until his death in Macomb, Georgia on February 4th, 1901. So let's talk about our next gentleman, which is Robert C. DeLarge. Now you see Robert C. DeLarge was born March 15th, 1842, February 14th, 1874. DeLarge was born in Alcorn, South Carolina. Some records indicated as DeLarge was born of a slave, was likely that he was the offspring of a free mulatto parents. He serves as an agent for the Freeman's Bureau and helped organize the Republican Party in South Carolina. He was a politician and a Republican member of the United States House of Representatives of Fort South Carolina, serving from 1870 to 1873. He was an early delegate to the 1868 State Constitutional Convention and elected in 1868 to the State House of Representatives for one term. Now, with his family, they did own slaves, and members of the free mulatto elite had those opportunities that others did not have. So those of darker skin. By trade, he was a tailor and a farmer before actually gaining a lucrative employment with the Confederate Navy during the Civil War. Perhaps regretting that some of his finance windfalls, DeLarge later donated most of his wartime earnings to the Republican Party. Nevertheless, by 1870, he had amassed a fortune that exceeded 6,500 or 6,500. He moved within the Charleston highest circle and joined the Brown Fellowship Society, that exclusive organization for mulattoes. After the war, DeLarge worked for the Republican state government as an agent in the Free Bureau, as I stated before. He became an organizer of the South Carolina Republican Party. In 1867, at the age of 25, he was the chair of the platform committee of the Republican State Convention, which published a report calling for the following reforms. With these reforms, the abolishment of capital punishment, tax reforms, popular election for all officials and offices, welfare assistance, the breakup of land monopolies, court reorganization, and the liberal immigration laws. In 1868, he became a member of the South Carolina Congressional Convention, which revised the state existing constitution. At this convention, he lobbied for a petition which asked that the U.S. Congress for a $1 million grant to purchase land to be sold to the state for land-hungry poor. After the Congressional Convention, he moved quickly from one important position to another. During 1868 to 1869, session of the state legislation. DeLong chaired with Wayne and Mines committees. In 1871, the state legislature chose DeLong as land commissioner for the state. So you can actually see with him, he's actually making his way through the political party of the Republican Party, going from one chair to another, making advancements along the way. As land commissioner, he implemented but then cleared of charges. So what actually happened with him was that he was actually implemented for being actually stealing money. Those charges of land fraud and so forth. In 1870, was elected to represent South Carolina, 2nd Congressional District in Washington. Began his term in the U.S. Congress on March 4th, 1871. However, he was not allowed to serve his entire term. Charges of election fraud levied by the Democratic opponent of Christopher C. Braun. So, because of these charges of elections fraud and also being charged, even though he was cleared, being charged of land fraud, you see that they're actually going to say that, he's a criminal. South Carolina Representative Joseph Rainey plead on the House floor for a delay in the case, but the committee reported that the many abuse and irregularities during the election may determine a victor impossible. So, on January 24th, 1873, declared that the seat vacant for the rest of the 42nd Congress, set to adjourn in March. The full House agreed with the committee finding. Defending his seat in the 42nd Congress took a toll on him, leaving his fragile health and left him with few options other than to retire. Another African American politician actually got his seat, and that was Alonzo Reasoner won his seat. When he left Washington, DeLong returned to South Carolina, where he was appointed as Charleston magistrate. He served the people of Charleston until his death at the age of 31 on February 14th, 1874. So despite his difficult relationship with South Carolina Republicans, that's actually how he was. They gave him the city magistrate statewide closed their office on the day of his funeral to show their respects. So even though they were fighting among each other, difficult relationships with South Carolina Republicans, they did give him that respect for his funeral. Okay, next person we're going to talk about is Robert Brown Ellington. Now, we're going to find out that with Mr. Ellington, was born on August the 11th, 1842, likely of West Indian parents in Liverpool, England. He received a public education in England and learned to be a tie setter trade. He served with the British Navy, arriving on a warship in Boston around 1867. Historic records show that in the late 1864, he was living in Charleston, South Carolina, where he was an associate editor for the South Carolina Leader, a Freeman newspaper owned by the future Representative Richard H. Kane. Elliott married Grace Lee, a free mulatto, sometime before 1870, and the couple had no children. He quickly dove into the Reconstructed era Republican politics in his new South Carolina home, emerging as a leader figure of the 1868 state Constitutional Convention. One of 78 Black delegates at the convention, he advocated for public education, although he opposed school integration and helped defeat the imposition of poll tax and of literacy tests for voters. As a state Republican convention that year, he was nominated for lieutenant governor, but dropped out of the race after finishing third on the first ballot. Later in 1868, while serving as the only Black member of the Barnwell County Board of Commissioners, Elliott was elected to the State House of Representatives, where he remained until 1870. He was almost elected as Speaker, placed second on the ballot. And he went on to receive influence assignments as chairman of the committees on the railroad and chairman on the committee of privilege and elections. In 1869, because of his military background, Elliott was appointed an assistant adjutant general for South Carolina. He became the first African American commanding general of the South Carolina National Guard, which as the state militia was charged with fighting the Ku Klux Klan. In 1870, in October, Republicans in the West Central South Carolina Congressional District nominated him over incumbent Samuel L. Hodge to run for the seat of U.S. House of Representatives. The district includes the capital and had only a slight Black majority. The seat was once held by the Representative Piston Brooks, notorious for his cane assault on Senator Charles Summers in 1856. So that was the district he was actually representing. Elliott faced Union Reform Party candidate John E. Beacom, the son of the prominent aristocratic country family. Edison soundly defeated him with 60% of the votes and was sworn in as the 42nd Congressional on March 4, 1871. White colleagues received Elliott coldly. His dark skin came as a shock as the two other African Americans on the floor, Joseph Rainey and Jefferson Long, were light-skinned mulattoes. And for this, the description that they actually give him is this: described as the first genuine African in Congress. Elliott seemed to embody the new political opportunities and Southern whites' apprehension ushered in by the emancipation. He later recalled, "I shall never forget my first day in Congress. I found myself the center of attraction. Everything was still." So this is actually coming out of him going on the floor. Furthermore, his politics was more radical than his African American colleagues, and his unwavering stance for Black civil rights made many representatives of both parties wary of his intentions. Elliott was given a position on the Committee of Education and Labor, where he served during both of his terms. So even for the other two and some of the other ones, he was considered to be a radical with his harsh ways of what he was actually trying to succeed when he actually got elected. Just 10 days after he was sworn in, he was challenged in challenging the amnesty bill, which reestablished the political rights of nearly all former Confederates, and quickly followed the speech with another supporting the Ku Klux Klan bill, aimed to curb the terrorist activities of the clandestine organization. Elliott argued against the amnesty bill, which was ultimately failed, as a measure passing the following year. What he actually tried to do in effect to enact legislation to weaken the Klan was more successful. In April 1st speech, he read a letter posed by the Klansmen of the Union Courthouse jail, following it with words about the prejudice against his race. It is custom, sir, of Democrat, then parentheses, newspaper, to stigmatize the Negro of the South as being in a semi-barbarous condition. But pray tell me, who is the barbarian here, the murderer or the victim? I flame back to the teeth of those who make it the most false and foul accusation upon the Negro of the Southern states. The third Ku Klux Klan bill, which reinforced Freeman's voting rights, passed it and was signed into law 3 weeks later. The following October, President Ulysses S. Grant used the power granted him by the bill to suspend habeas corpus in 9 Southern states, facilitating the prosecution of Klansmen. Because of his action, Elliott felt his life was in danger. Therefore, before leaving for Columbia, which is the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., the following day, he wrote to his wife with instruction in case of his death. During his second term, Elliott worked to help pass Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner's Civil Rights Bill to eliminate discrimination from public transportation, public accommodation, and schools. Elliott gained national attention from his speech rebuffing opponents of the bill, who argued that federal enforcement of the civil rights was unconstitutional. Before a packed house, Elliott stated his universal support for civil rights. And this is what he says. I regret, sir, that the dark hue of my skin may lead a color to the imputation that I am controlled by motive personally to myself in my advocacy of this great measure of national justice. The motion that impels me to restrict to no such boundaries, but is as broad as your Constitution. I advocate it because it is right. So what actually happened is the Chicago Tribune published a glowing review noting the fair-skinned man in Congress might learn something from this Black man. So they're trying to shame the other ones. Talking about the former Confederate Vice President Alexander Stevenson of Georgia, who had been reelected to the House. In 1876, he was elected to South Carolina Attorney General. This would be the last political office. Democrats returned to power in 1876, ending the state Reconstruction period. Elliott continued to practice law until 1879, when he was accepted an appointment of Special Custom Inspector for the United States Treasury Department. 1 year later, he worked for the Secretary of Treasury, John Sherman, presidential campaign as the manager of Sherman's Black delegates. In 1881, Elliott moved to North New Orleans, where he established another law practice. Unfortunately, malaria ended his life on August the 9th, 1884 in New Orleans, Louisiana, just 2 days before his 42nd birthday. So that's actually what happened to Mr. Elliott. Okay. The next gentleman we have is Benjamin Sterling Turner. As you can see here, he actually represented Alabama. He was the first congressional district of the 42nd United States Congress. And a former slave and a self-made businessman, Benjamin Taylor focused on restoring peace and repairing economic damage of the war-ravaged South. The U.S. Census of 1870 reported Turner as owing $250,000 in real estate and $10,000 in personal property, making him one of the wealthiest freemen in Alabama. Turner also became a teacher in 1865 and helped establish the first school for African American children. 2 years later, he became involved in politics, participating in the Republican State Convention in 1867. Turner was named tax collector in Dallas County. The following year, he won his first election office when he became a Selma City councilman. In 1870, Turner was elected to the United States Congress and the first African American representative for Alabama. Turner was noted on the House floor is this: these people have struggled longer and labored harder and have made more of the raw materials than any people in the world. Since they have been free, they have not slacked in their industry, but materially improved their economy. While in office, Turner proposed bills that contribute funding for the Civil War, relating damages to several federal buildings in central Alabama and St. Paul Episcopal Church. Turner was also appointed to the House Committee on Invalid Prisons and was responsible for issuing pensions for Union War veterans. Though his influence, African American veterans received a pension of $8 a month. So he was influenced with that. He also fought for improvement of Black farmers. In February of 1872, he called for the elimination of the taxes on cotton because it was harmful for many of his constituents. He also argued for tax with unconstitutional because of the single out of the Pacific cash crop as well. In May of 1872, he demanded that the tax be refunded for the year of 1866 to 1868. He also became the first congressional congressman to call for the retribution for ex-slaves. All of his proposals were ignored by Congress. Turner ran for a second term in 1872, but was challenged in the Republican primary by another African American candidate, Philip Joseph, a freeman before the Civil War and an editor of the local newspaper. And what they actually believe is that the reason why was to divide the votes. And what actually happened was a white Republican won the primary and eventually the congressional seat. After his career, Turner turned into political activities, emerged in 1880 to attend the Alabama Labor Union Convention and served as a delegate to the Republican National Convention in Chicago. He then returned to his livery stable in Selma, eventually lost his business during the national economic downturn of the end of the 1870s. Restoring to make his living as a farmer, unfortunately, he died penniless on March 21st, 1894. So this is actually what you can see that happened after him. And this is going to be our last gentleman, Joshua Thomas Wells. Now, Mr. Wells actually served 3 terms in the U.S. Congress between 1871 and 1876. And he was actually the first African American in the United States Congress to actually represent Florida. And as I state, he's the only Black representative from Florida until the early 1990s. Wells was unseated twice on the recommendation of the House Committee on Elections. So they had problems with that. He was born into slavery in Winchester, Virginia. He was suspected to be the son of his master, Dr. John Wells, and maintained contact with him throughout his life. When the Civil War broke out, Walls was forced to be a private servant of the Confederate artillerymen until he was captured by Union soldiers in 1862. Emancipated by the Union captors, Walls briefly attended the Community Normal School in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. By July 1863, he served the United States Army as part of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, United States Colored Troops based in Philadelphia, PA. He rose in rank to first sergeant. Prior to his discharge from the Army in 1865, Walls married Helen Fortin of Newsville, Florida. After leaving the United States Army, he settled in Alshuka County, Florida, and became active in local politics. After passage of the United States Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, Walls joined the newly formed Republican Party in Florida. He was elected delegate in 1868 and state constitutional convention, and shortly afterwards was elected to the lower house of the state legislatures in 1868. He advocated to the state Senate representing the 13th district, which was mostly the Alshuka County in 1869. Walls' 6-year tenure at the United States Congressman was filled with controversy. He was the only Black representative unseated 3 times about his opponent's challenge of his election in 1870, 1872, and 1874, including J.J. Finley of the former Confederate general. Walls compelled a legislative record, which include introducing bills favoring land grants to railroads and securing connections to ports serving Cuba and the West Indies. He also submitted measure of reinforcing the Civil Rights Act of 1866. After serving in Congress, he returned to Florida State legislation and resumed farming on his 175-acre plantation near Gainesville, Florida. He also acquired in 1873. Walls also purchased a newspaper, The New Era, it was called. He remained active in politics, serving as various times as mayor of Gainesville, a member of the County Board of Public Instruction, and county commissioner. In 1898, he moved to Tallahassee to become the farmers director at what is now Florida's A&M University. Walls worked at the Florida A&M University until his death in Tallahassee on May 15, 1905. With that, Joshua Walls had fallen into obscurity. No Florida newspaper actually published his obituary. So with the conclusion, since 1870, when Senator Herman Reels of Mississippi and Representative Joseph Ream of South Carolina became the first African American to serve in Congress, more than 162 African Americans had served in the U.S. representative delegates or senators. When the federal troops left the South in 1877, the Reconstruction ended. So did the era of opportunities. African Americans gradually disappeared from the public office, from the local level to the United States Senate. As Southern states passed Jim Crow laws enforcing segregation in the 1980s, African Americans was barred from the polls and from political office. So folks, I'd like to say, I hope you enjoy the program. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. As you can see here, if you want to contact me, I am with the Civil War Defenses of Washington. I am Supervisor Park Ranger Kenya J. Finley Jean. My email is Kenya, Kenya _ Finley, Finley, @ MPS or you can always give me a call or a text on 202-603-1004. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenley. We do have a couple questions from the audience, and before I ask them, I'm just going to remind the audience that you can put your question in the chat box or Q&A box at any time. Finley, would you mind going on camera for us?
Yep, I'm coming now.
Great. All right.
There we go.
Great. Our first question comes from Lynn, who writes, does the current Congressional Black Caucus keep a history of these early African-American statesmen? There seem several similarities with modern statesmen and women.
Actually, they actually do. You can actually probably, I believe they have their own website. So with that, you can go on their website and actually find more information about these people in greater depth than what I did.
Our next question is it true that after George White from North Carolina, who served his last day in 1901 in Congress, that there were no African-American congressmen from the 11 or 13 Confederate states until 72 years later when Andrew Young Jr. became congressman from Georgia in 1973?
I would say that sounds correct. I am not 100% sure about that, but that do sounds correct. I would actually have to look into that to see if that's accurate.
All right. If you have a question for Kenya, you can put that in the chat box or the Q&A box. We still do have a little bit more time for questions. In the meantime, I did find the Congressional Black Caucus history website, so I'm going to put that website in the chat box for you to look at your leisure. And Kenya, while I wait to see if there are any questions from the audience, I would just like to ask, how did you get started as a park ranger doing these sorts of talks?
Well, I would say first of all, how did I actually become a park ranger? I would say literally fell into the position. While I was in college, they actually had a program which they still have today, which is called the Pathways programs, where they encourage, young folks who are still going to school on their breaks, summer breaks, to actually apply to Park Service to become a park ranger or a park guide. And with that, I did that for 3 years. And then I decided, I was like, wow, this is a really cool job. How can I actually get into it? And that actually gave me a way to actually go in, and I had to go through the interview process and so forth. So when I graduated, I didn't become a park ranger right then. Actually took me a year after graduation to actually get a position with Park Service, and that was actually as a park guide. And as time went on, I was able to move up to become a supervisor park ranger. And with these programs is that if we did not have the pandemic of COVID, I actually would be in the library right along with everyone else, giving these kind of talks that I think people are really interested in. Like I stated before in the beginning, I never heard of these folks beforehand until I started reading about different materials dealing with the Civil War, dealing with the Reconstruction period, and also after that, talking to folks and then talking about, well, look what this was going on with that and the Civil Rights Movement. So that's actually how I got into doing research about these kind of program folks and doing a program with it, and then reaching out to the libraries or the schools, because at one point we do go into schools to talk about these things that might just get overlooked, not being on the syllabus of the teachers at that time.
We did have a couple more questions come in. Lynn would like to know, is there any program to encourage young people of color to consider working with the National Park Service?
Yes, there is different programs, like I stated, and what I would say is definitely you can go on USA Jobs. that is the website for actually any federal service. You can actually go on that site. And what they do have on there besides that is they talk about recent grads. They talk about how to get into the pathway systems. So they do have things of that nature. Also, if you are near a national park site, I would say go to that site, go to that park, talk to the rangers there. Um, Actually, you probably could actually get into their human resource person and actually talk about any activities or any kind of events they were doing to see if you would, just like to shadow a ranger and to see if they like to do that, or any of the different departments. It's not just rangers that are there, but you do have uh, botanists, and you have scientists, you have um, whole slew of different people with different majors to actually go in to see if that would be something that you would like to do.
We have a question from Coral. Coral writes, do you have any idea when African-American women began to be elected to Congress?
No, I do not. Maybe that should, you know what, let me write that down, because then that could be something I can start working on a program with.
And Lynn, along those lines, Lynn writes, what special project or research are you working on now?
Well, there's one program I'm working with right now is actually talking about the last enslaved ship that actually came to the United States. It was actually after the law of stopping the African trade, but there was a ship that actually smuggled in about 150 enslaved people to the United States. So it was actually right before the Civil War, and I'm working on a program to talk about that and how they actually started their own community actually in the Carolinas.
Well, I hope you'll come back and talk to us more about that once you finish your research on it.
Sure, no problem.
I don't see any other questions for you, so I'm going to just take a moment to tell the audience about my next upcoming program. Audience, if you have any final questions for Ranger Finley, Jean, go ahead and put those in the chat box while I talk. My next program is going to be on Monday, August 30th at 7 p.m. Local author Linda Smolkin is going to talk about her book, Among the Branded. It's a contemporary fiction book with a historical twist. So if you like historical fiction or contemporary fiction that talks about history, I encourage you to take a look at the event. I put a link in the chat box. She is self-published, so she'll be talking about her book, her writing process, and self-publishing in general. So that'll be Monday, August 30th at 7 p.m. I'd love to see you all there. I don't see any other comments from the audience at this time. So I want to say thank you so much, Kenya, for being here with us.
No problem.
Kenya, do you have any words for our audience?
So once again, folks, I'd like to say thank you for coming. I enjoyed talking and engaging with you. Once again, if you have any comments or something that might come to you later, once again, my email address is Kenya, Kenya _Finley, FINLEY, at N as in Nancy, P as in Paul, S as in Sam, .gov. And if you have any questions or comments, please give me a holler on email and I'll get back with you. So I'd like to say thank you very much, folks, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, Kenya. I've put her email in the chat box. All right. Thank you, Kenya, for coming out on a Tuesday. And thank you to our audience for spending their Tuesday night with us. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.